Ik kijk tegenaan.
Ja?
Oh ja, die komen.
Heeft misschien interesse in het boek van Charles Ruffalo, de man die Clinton naar Nederland heeft gehaald.
Ja, ik heb hem net.
Nou. Ja.
Nee hoor, dat is zo. Ik wil wel eerst de...
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. First, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I know that I had to put this together in 7 days, and I wish I could have put more people in this room, but I only had enough for this 180. But I'd like to thank a special person, President Clinton. Thank you very much for taking the time of your busy schedule. I know you're over here, but I know I was able to get it worked out that you come here for giving back.
I want to thank the Ruffalos for bringing us together, for giving back. And John, thank you for the first copy of my book in Dutch. It gives a whole new meaning in English to the term Dutch treat. I just want to make a couple of brief remarks, and then I understand some of the young people who are here may have a few questions for me. First of all, I thank all of you for supporting this endeavor. If you read my book, there's probably never been an autobiography of any relatively well-known figure who gave so much credit to his teachers and other adult mentors as you will find throughout this book. Starting with people who helped me when I was 4 years old, going all the way up until I finished law school. Indeed, my editor made me cut out about 15 pages on my university years. He said, "No one will believe you. No one believes that anyone remembers every teacher they had, what they said in class, and what you learned from them." And I said, "But you see it here. I showed you the notes." And he said, "Yeah, but you have to cut it out." So I did, and then I did an interview with Dan Rather, the CBS correspondent. Some of you probably know who he is. And Rather said, "You know, I really loved what you wrote in the 1960s about your years at college. I wish you had written a little more about it." But I say that to point out that those of you who have given money to this endeavor may never know where your influence ends. And this country, like my country, is growing ever more diverse. We have lots and lots of first-generation immigrants. And the first-generation immigrants and their children who are coming to our countries remind me a very great deal of my parents' and grandparents' generation of people whom I knew as a boy. And that brings me to this book. People ask me all the time, "Well, how did you get to be president? It's remarkable. You overcame all these obstacles." And all. I actually think I had a lot of advantages in the modern world in becoming president. I had a wonderful education. I had fabulous teachers. I had adults who loved me and cared for me. But I also was the last generation, part of the last generation of Americans to be in the pre-television culture. We were 10 years old before I had a television. When I was born in my home state, the income of my state was about half the American average. No one had any money. Most people had not finished high school. Fewer than 10% of the adults had a university degree. But it made the society very egalitarian, very democratic, because the person who was fixing your tire might have an intelligence as great as the person who was taking your tonsils out. My mother's family, my grandmother, my great aunt, and my great uncle, who was one of the most important influences in my life, all had extremely high intelligence and no education. And I basically grew up at their feet as a little boy in a culture where no one had any money, no one ever took vacations, everyone worked, and no one felt poor as long as they had clean clothes, a place to sleep, and enough food to feed whoever walked in the door. And all of our lives were organized around meals. And believe me, this is the same as true of countless immigrant families in Europe and the United States today. I know because I've been in their homes and I've talked to them in the workplace, and I know it's just like the culture into which I was born. And it was an enormous advantage in political life because the only entertainment we had was storytelling. And we had one little movie theater that changed movies about every 3 weeks, and I could go to that for a dime. 10 cents I paid to go to the movie. That's how old I am. But anyway, and before you could tell a story, you had to learn to listen to one. So I thought, people ask me all the time, how'd you get to be president? And it's an amazing story. It's really not such an amazing story. One of the Dutch journalists on the way down here said, how do you connect with people so well all over the world? Why do people like you? I said, why do people like you? He said, what do you mean? I said, people like you if you like them. And they know that. That's something you can't hide. So I want to just read this little section of my book. And then I want to encourage first the young people who are here to ask questions. And if anybody else has a question, you can. This is early in the book. I'm describing my family life, as I just told you. And I was talking about my uncle, Buddy, who lived to be 91 years old, who had no education and was without question the smartest person in my family, including me. And he remembered everything that ever happened to him until he died at 91. And he'd only had about 6 years of formal schooling, maybe 7. But I said this. Well into his 80s, my uncle could tell amazing stories highlighting the personalities of dogs he had owned 50 or 60 years earlier. He remembered their names, their looks, their peculiar habits, how he came by them, and the precise way in which they retrieved the birds he shot. Lots of people would come by his house and sit on the porch for a visit. After they left, he would have a story about them or their children. Sometimes funny, sometimes sad, usually sympathetic, and always understanding. I learned a lot from the stories my uncle, aunts, and grandparents told me. That no one is perfect, but most people are good. That people can't be judged only by their worst or weakest moments. That harsh judgments can make hypocrites of us all. That a lot of life is just showing up and hanging on. That laughter is often the best and sometimes the only response to pain. Perhaps most important, I learned that everyone has a story of dreams and nightmares, hope and heartache, love and loss, courage and fear, sacrifice and selfishness. All my life, I've been interested in other people's stories. I've wanted to know them, understand them, feel them. When I grew up and got into politics, I always felt the main point of my work was to give people a chance to have better stories. That's what this book's about. So, Before I ask if there are any questions, let me make one other point. I drew one general conclusion from spending 2 years and 2 months writing the story of my life, and that is that every person who lives to be 50 years old should do it. Maybe not a book this long, maybe not an elaborate process. If only for your children, your grandchildren, and your closest friends, if you're lucky enough to live to be 50 years old, you should take a little time. Maybe you could do it over 2 weekends. Maybe it's only 20 or 30 pages long. Maybe you don't even do it in the computer. You write it out in a notebook. But you should write the story of your life. It was overwhelming to me to hear the comments of my daughter having the opportunity to read about how her great-grandparents lived in a totally different world. Young people today have access to the internet. They may see 100 channels on a satellite television. They may know more things than anybody their ages have ever known before. But if they're not careful, they can be completely uprooted from a past that seems like the dark ages to them. And yet I find I spend a lot of time with young people in their 20s. They all want to know where they came from, how their people lived, what their culture was, what their religious background was, how they came to be who they are. So for whatever it's worth, to those few of you in the audience who are at least as old as I am, I recommend that. And to those of you who aren't, you think about it. If you live to be 50, you owe it to your younger relatives, your children, your grandchildren, others, to just write the simple story of your life. It will mean more to them than you can imagine. Seeing what it meant to my own child to know the things that I took for granted convinced me that that is so.
Very special for you. I'd like to give you. You came here, and Giving Back's motto is to provide a new sense of direction. And I just heard you said before you're 50, write a book. Well, I'm 48, sir, and I wrote my book. And I'd like to give you my book. But there's a big difference between my book and your book. You're in my book.
I thought he was going to say that mine was too long. So thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Any students? Go ahead.
Janet?
One of the values of Giving Back is hope. You were born in Hope, Arkansas, and what does hope mean to you?
It means that, first of all, hope is a state of mind. It is a decision you make every day. And I want to emphasize that because I've had reviewers read my book and say, I know how this guy survived all his problems now. And another reviewer who wrote a wonderful book about my life said, oh, Bill Clinton was much sadder than I thought he was. He was more pessimistic than I thought I would, because I wrote about some of the dark things that happened and how I felt about them. And that's not right. Hope is not something that you just sort of have or you don't. You have to make a decision about how you're going to look at every day. And I learned that from my mother. My father was killed in a car wreck before I was born. My mother's second husband was an alcoholic who beat her until I got big enough to stop him. My mother was married 5 times to 4 men, and 3 of them died on her. She had a lot of problems. And she got up every day with the expectation that something good was going to happen, and that she could make something good happen, and that how she thought of her life was a choice. So hope to me is the belief that today can be better than yesterday and tomorrow can be better than today. And no matter what happens to you, life is still a gift. Because no matter how bad you feel today, someone your age or younger died today in a way that was completely unfair and completely unfortunate. In the roulette wheel of life, somebody was taken away, and you're still here. Therefore, it is cynical and selfish to live without hope. That's what I believe.
Now I'm meeting the President of the United States, Mr. Bill Clinton, the 42nd President, and I'm really honored. You mentioned in your book you met President John F. Kennedy, and would you like to share that experience with us?
I met him 41 years ago, next week. 10 days from now, next week. 10 days from now, 41 years ago, I met him. And I remember it like it was yesterday. I was selected by my school to go to this citizenship program in the Capitol called Boys